Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Crucero Wash Process Colombia from Frukt Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Frukt, based out of Turku, Finland. And this is the fourth time Frukt has appeared on this channel, having recently reviewed the Crucero AB, their wash processed Canyon coffee. And I did purchase that coffee and this coffee from the same shop at the same time. But this is the one I was much more interested in, as this one sounds much more like my type of coffee. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 42. And recipe we went with for this coffee was the same as our previous Frukt review, which was a 15:1 water to coffee ratio. Brewed at 94 degrees Celsius, about 201 degrees Fahrenheit. This one I did prefer through the V60 though, which would indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one is also very similar to our previous Frukt review. That's to say that this is a very light coffee, holding true to the term Nordic light, as it's not to the extent where it's grainy and overly delicate, but still very light by most standards and metrics. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression. Ran it through the V60 and the cup was noticeably bright right at the forefront, but it did settle down into a very well-defined dried fruit in a tropical sense, finishing off in a quite sweet manner. So for the most part, it left a very positive first impression. Day 17, ran it through the Chemex, and it feels like the coffee might need a bit more rest, as there was a slightly undefined brightness to the cup, a slightly bitter tropicality, as well as there was more of the previously mentioned dried fruits, but for the most part, not an overly well-defined profile to this one yet. Day 19, ran it through the April brewer, and perhaps the most tame the coffee had been up to this point, as it was offering a bit more clarity in terms of the classic South American forward profile, but a little bit more of the complementary characteristics were on the subtle side of things. Soft tropicals all around, as that was probably the most distinct and noticeable thing about this coffee. So not necessarily my favorite, but we continue on to day 23 as we up the temperatures. Ran it back through the V60, and the cup is the best it had been up to this point, as there was definitely more of the sweetness that was felt in a slightly more desserty manner. Most definition to the cup to this point, as there was a dried tropical fruit aspect, so much better. Best results I've had so far. But we continue on to day 27 as we tried the Chemex one more time, but opted to stick to the V60 from that point going forward, as it didn't really seem to offer the same sort of vibrancy as the previous day we had with the V60. A little less of that kind of desserty sweetness to the cup, as there was more of the tropical brightness on the back end, but otherwise a little bit more on the tame side of things, and both of those attempts with the Chemex yielded some very tame results. Opens up a little bit more as it does cool down, with the illicit passion fruit maybe being the most pronounced and prominent it has been up to this point, but even then on the more subtle and delicate side of things all around. Day 31, adjusted to the mentioned older Frukt recipe and at a higher concentration, lower temperatures, and it seemed to be yielding mildly improved results, as there was slightly more of the fruit forward brightness, still leaning a bit into that dried fruit aspect, but also in a fresh fruit sense, ranging from things like pineapple to mango to a slight caramel sweetness as well, with a slight herbal aspect as well. A little bit better, but even then, there was something that was still slightly lacking about this coffee, but we would continue on to day 35 as I continue with the same adjustments, and the coffee continues to remain relatively tame, I think, to the expectations I had had for it, as the most distinct thing I felt was a moderate mango-like quality complemented by a citric brightness once again. Even then, the dessertiness felt relatively mild, as the best descriptor I had for this one was maybe an unsweetened candied aspect to this one. Day 39, final notes we have, same thing, a more concentrated recipe, and it's helping with the definition to the coffee, as there's a bit more of the pineapple-like brightness to the cup, a little bit more of the mango and just tropicals in general, but for the most part, the coffee remains mildly sweet with a long-lasting, what I would describe as a clear sugar aspect to the cup. I mentioned on the previous day that it was like an unsweetened candy, and maybe a clear sugar component is kind of a better way to describe that. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a couple of level 4s, so Let's go ahead and start with the cleanliness, level 4. Yes, this is everything you'd expect from a wash-processed Colombian coffee. It is a pretty clean cup of coffee. Even if it doesn't necessarily have the most defined and pronounced profile to it, it still is lacking any of the things that would deter it from having that cleanliness, so definitely right there at that level 4 mark. Finish, level 4. Yes, and it might actually be on the lower side of level 4 because there is that slightly desserty quality to it in a somewhat more mild manner, and I think that's what pushes it up to that level 4 mark, but even then it doesn't necessarily have the most strong or long-lasting finish. So on the slightly lower side of the level 4, stone fruit, level 4. Yes, for me, the most pronounced characteristic to this one was mango. Once again, I am spacing whether or not they actually have that listed here on the bag as one of the flavor profiles to this one. I know that passion fruit, I think it's passion fruit candy and maybe mango, but nonetheless, I feel like that stone fruit aspect, that slightly more sugary, desserty stone fruit aspect was the most pronounced characteristic for me. And then we have a bunch of level 3s. We'll start with the body, level 3. No part of that is surprising either, as that's what you'd expect from a wash-processed Colombian coffee with the V60 as the preferred brew method, so really don't have too much to say on that. Fair bit of texture to it in general, as expected. Sweetness, level 3. That, once again, is going to be the slightly big sticking point to me, as this one was sweeter than the Kenyan coffee we had reviewed, but even then, I couldn't necessarily justify that level 4 mark. Towards the end, that final note we had, and here again on day 42, if I was being super generous, I could push it to that level 4, still on the lower side of level 4, but even then, maybe not necessarily to the same extent as what I would expect from a classic level 4 for that sweetness. Acidity, level 3. Yes, this one is bright, but I think I was kind of comparing and contrasting this one to the Kenyan coffee, which I've done a lot throughout the time. I mean, I drank them every single day side by side, and the Kenyan coffee just had a little bit more brightness to it. So this one right here, it's on the higher side of level 3, but maybe not to the same extent as that Kenyan coffee. So just kept that one toned down a little bit more. Florality, level 3. Yes, it's a slightly more subtle, tame, delicate floral aspect to this coffee, but as I'd also mentioned with the Kenyan coffee, that the savoriness reached that level 3 mark, not because it was an overly savory coffee, but because the coffee in general was a little bit more tame and delicate. That's the same thing I'm doing with this one, as this one had a floral aspect to it. Not the most pronounced thing, but given that this coffee was a little bit more delicate and tame to begin with, it was able to push that all the way up to that level 3 mark, even if it's not the most pronounced characteristic. And that's in line with the berry fruit, as the passion fruit they have listed on here would fall into that berry fruit category, but at no point would I say it was an overly pronounced component within this one. The citrus fruit at the time was the more pronounced characteristic. So if anything, that one is on the higher side of level 3, but even then it's not an overly prominent factor within this coffee. The stone fruit, yeah, that's going to be the only fruit component that I feel like was justified there. The caramel level 3 is kind of interesting because that one actually does fall in line with the caramel as opposed to just being a little bit more of a generic candy. But even then I've said that it's like a clear sugar at times, and even then it's also somewhat of an unsweetened candy. So maybe the best way to describe that is think of a candy that you've been maybe working with for a bit, and you've like a hard candy that you've been sucking on for a while, and then it kind of loses that intensity and flavor that it had originally. That may be the best way I can kind of describe this coffee in that sense. And then, yeah, I think that's about it. I mean, everything else kind of falls into level 2 category, so those are pretty much the only things worth discussing in this tasting wheel. I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. In this one, I had much higher expectations for, so that's why this one's maybe a little bit more of a letdown than that Kenyan coffee was. I did like this one a little bit more, but we continue to see the same pattern with all of the Frukt coffees I've reviewed up to this point, and that's that they can't seem to get above that level 3 mark in terms of the sweetness, and it could be on me really struggling to work with these coffees, and I continue to go back on that because for whatever reason, I really struggle brewing these Frukt coffees, and I've heard so many more positive things about their coffees in general, and I feel like people are maybe able to get a little bit more sweetness. But if this is kind of the way that this coffee roaster is supposed to go, maybe they are supposed to be in line with some of my older previous experiences with a lot of Says coffees who happen to share a lot of these same characteristics, then I'm getting these coffees right. It just seems to be that they might not necessarily be my specific types of coffees, as even though on paper, lighter profiled wash processed coffee should be my type of coffee, it's that loring sticking point again, and I know I keep going back to and discussing the loring as not necessarily being my favorite, but it's for this reason specifically. At times they can be a little bit too clean and delicate, as they seem to lack that sort of vibrancy that I experience from a lot of other machines in general, and that's possibly what happened with this one. And if that's the case, then and it's not necessarily on me, but I can't help but feel that my struggles with these Frukt coffees keep coming back to me, and there's something I need to do to maybe get a little bit more out of them. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, just like with the Kenyan, I'm going to say the same thing for this Colombian coffee. If you do like these profiled sort of coffees, previous experiences with maybe some of Say's Colombian coffees, then this one could be a good fit for you, as it did offer a nice desserty sweetness at the start, and at times you're able to experience that in somewhat of a prominent abundance. But even then, it's a lighter profiled, cleaner coffee in general, with maybe a little bit more tame of a base, so it's not necessarily skewing very heavily in terms of a specific direction, offering too much vibrancy, but just a little bit more of a kind of balanced, softer, delicate coffee in general. I think for the most part, that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And this right here has been a review of the Crucero Wash Process Colombia from Frukt Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.